The Silk Roads, A New History of the World by Peter Frankopan. Picture this, a young boy lying in bed each night, eyes tracing the contours of a giant world map hanging beside him. Not for homework, just pure fascination. He'd whisper the names of countries and capitals, follow the serpentine paths of rivers across continents, lose himself in those vast blue oceans. But the parts that really set his imagination on fire? The names written in italics, the ones that seemed to pulse with mystery and danger, the Gobi Desert, the Himalayas, the Hindu Kush. As that boy grew older, something began to gnaw at him. The history lessons at school felt incomplete, like listening to a symphony, but only hearing the violins. The story always went the same way. Start with ancient Greece, hop over to Rome, then watch Western Europe blossom into the Renaissance and Enlightenment, until finally, triumphantly, we arrive at modern America. A tidy narrative, progress in a straight line, everything important happening in one tiny corner of that enormous map on his wall. But here's the thing that bothered him. What about all those other places? Those massive regions? Central Asia, Persia, China, India? Barely got a mention. They were treated like empty stage scenery while the real action supposedly unfolded in Europe. What if we've been reading the map upside down this whole time? What if the story of humanity doesn't revolve around Rome or London at all, but around cities with names that sound almost mythical? Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv. Places most of us couldn't even find on a map today. Yet for centuries they were the beating heart of civilization. This is the radical proposition at the core of today's book, The Silk Roads, A New History of the World, by Oxford historian Peter Frankopan. This isn't just another dusty history tome. It's a complete reorientation. Imagine taking that world map and spinning it around until everything you thought you knew looks completely different. For thousands of years, the real center of the world wasn't in the West. It was in the intricate web of roads, rivers, and trade routes connecting East and West. The Silk Roads. Here's my promise to you. By the time we're done today, you'll never look at a world map the same way again. You'll see that human history isn't about the inevitable rise of the West. It's about the connections that have bound us all together. It's a story of exchange, conflict, and a global center of gravity that's now shifting back to exactly where it spent most of history. Ready? Let's dive in. Forget Athens and Rome for a moment. Our story begins somewhere most history classes skip right over, the fertile lands of Mesopotamia and Persia. This was the actual cradle of civilization, the place where it all started. Long before Europe was anything more than scattered tribes in cold forests, the Persian Empire was a superpower stretching from the Greek coastline all the way to the Himalayas. And here's what made Persia special: radical openness. The Persians were cultural sponges. Defeated an enemy who had better clothing? They'd adopt it. Found better ideas? They'd use them. They built a road network so efficient that messages could travel over 600 miles in a week, something that must have seemed like pure magic to the ancient Greeks. The empire was swimming in wealth. Gold from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, ivory from India flowing into cities like Babylon and Persepolis. To the Greeks, everything that mattered came from the East: culture, wealth, opportunity, and threats. So when a young, wildly ambitious general from Macedon named Alexander came to power, he never once glanced west. Why would he? Europe was a backwater, nothing there. His eyes, like everyone else's, were locked on the ultimate prize, Persia. Now, we usually think of Alexander's conquest of Persia as just a brilliant military campaign. But what he really did was plug the Greek world directly into the Persian world, creating something entirely new. It wasn't a one-way conquest. It was a collision. Greek language, art, and philosophy flooded eastward. You could find Greek inscriptions carved into stone as far as Afghanistan, with sayings from Delphi teaching kids to behave and elders to be wise. But here's where it gets fascinating. Ideas flowed back just as powerfully. The earliest statues of Buddha, They look remarkably like the Greek god Apollo. Buddhists encountered this visually striking religion and thought, we need to compete with this, so they borrowed the artistic style. Some scholars even think India's great epic, the Ramayana, was influenced by Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Stories, faiths, and philosophies were traveling along these routes, carried by merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims. Alexander didn't just build an empire, he jump-started the world's central nervous system. And that system was about to expand dramatically. On the other side of Asia, another giant was stirring, China's Han Dynasty. The Chinese were obsessed with one thing: horses. Not just any horses. The legendary heavenly horses from the Fergana Valley, powerful steeds rumored to sweat blood. These animals were crucial for defending against the fearsome nomadic tribes of the steppes, like the Xiongnu. To secure these horses and maintain peace, China established an elaborate tribute system. They gave gifts, rice, wine, textiles, but the most valuable export was silk. This beautiful, lightweight fabric became so prized that being wrapped in silk meant you were someone important. In a single year, China gave the Xiongnu 30,000 rolls of the stuff. This exchange was the beginning of something much bigger. China was opening a door to a transcontinental network, and they soon discovered something remarkable. Bamboo and cloth made in China's heartland were being sold thousands of miles away in the markets of Bactria, modern Afghanistan. The world was already connected. It just needed someone to give it a name. Centuries later, a German geologist named Ferdinand von Richthofen would call it the Silk Roads. These weren't just roads for silk, and they weren't even really roads. They were a sprawling, organic network, arteries branching in every direction, carrying goods, ideas, religions, technologies, and yes, even diseases. They were the world's central nervous system, mostly invisible, but absolutely vital. Now let's jump forward a few hundred years. While China was opening to the west, a small town on the Italian peninsula was methodically building an empire, Rome. But here's the key thing to understand. Rome's transformation into a superpower wasn't about conquering Europe. Europe was poor and undeveloped. The real engine of Rome's spectacular rise was the East. The turning point was seizing Egypt in 30 BC. The fabulous wealth of Egypt, built on the grain harvests of the Nile, came flooding into Rome. Grain prices crashed. Interest rates plummeted. Property values skyrocketed. Suddenly, everyone had money to spend. Emperor Augustus would later brag that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, all built on ruthlessly extracting wealth from the East. And this created an insatiable appetite for more. Soon, 120 Roman ships were sailing for India every year. The ports of India weren't just selling local goods. They were giant shopping malls for treasures from all over Southeast Asia, even Vietnam. Roman coins have been found across India in such quantities that local rulers probably melted them down to mint their own currency. The newly rich Romans developed legendary appetites: pheasants from the Black Sea, guinea fowl from Africa, rare fish, and, of course, silk from China. Conservative Romans were scandalized. The philosopher Seneca complained that silk garments barely qualified as clothing. They hid neither the curves nor the decency of Roman ladies. To the moral guardians, silk was exotic and, frankly, erotic. But the demand was unstoppable. Pliny the Elder calculated that 100 million sesterces a year were being drained from the Roman economy to pay for these luxuries, nearly half the empire's annual mint output. This flow of money transformed cities along the trade routes. Places like Palmyra in the Syrian desert, the Venice of the Sands, and Petra in Jordan became wonders of the world, their spectacular architecture funded by constant commerce. Here's the mind-blowing part. A gold coin struck in Britain could pay a soldier, get collected as tax, pass to a merchant heading east, buy spices in India, and end up in the Hindu Kush, where a local ruler might copy its design. 2,000 years ago, the world was already globalized. And flowing along these commercial arteries was something even more powerful than gold: ideas about God. The Silk Roads weren't just merchant highways, they were roads of faith. In the crowded spiritual marketplace of the ancient world, religions competed for converts with the same intensity merchants competed for profits. Buddhism, born in India, was one of the first viral success stories of this connected world. It spread rapidly across Asia, championed by rulers like Emperor Asoka. Its concepts even reached west. A religious sect in Alexandria, Egypt, the Therapeutae, bore an uncanny resemblance to Buddhism, focused on enlightenment through prayer and detachment from the self. Coincidence? Or evidence of how far these ideas could travel? As Buddhism encountered other faiths, it evolved to compete. Originally an intensely personal spiritual journey, it became more, let's say, theatrical. Statues of Buddha began appearing, modeled on Apollo. Shrines and stupas became pilgrimage sites. Music and offerings entered worship. Giving donations, gold, silver, diamonds, became a path to salvation. Monasteries sprang up along trade routes, becoming centers of scholarship where texts were copied and translated. The faith was adapting, becoming more accessible and compelling. Christianity was also an Eastern religion. Born in Jerusalem, its story shaped by Near Eastern deserts, spoken in Aramaic, rooted in Judaism. And like Buddhism, it spread along trade routes, though its success in the East was actually more spectacular than in the Mediterranean. By the early 3rd century, Christian communities dotted the Persian Gulf and reached as far as modern Afghanistan. This religious competition created tension. In Persia, the powerful Sasanian dynasty revived an ancient faith, Zoroastrianism, with its cosmic struggle between good and evil, light and darkness. Fire temples were built. A distinct Persian identity was asserted, and with it came persecution of Jews, Buddhists, and especially Christians. The promotion of one faith usually meant suppression of others. The real game-changer came in the early 4th century, when Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. When the most powerful man in the Western world embraced this Eastern religion, it was an earthquake, but it had a disastrous unintended consequence for Christians in the East. Constantine started portraying himself as protector of all Christians, including those in the rival Persian Empire. To the Persian Shah, this sounded like a threat. Christians inside his empire suddenly looked like a potential fifth column, an advance guard for Roman invasion. Constantine's embrace of Christianity, which laid the foundation for Christian Europe, simultaneously compromised Christianity's future in Asia. A brutal wave of persecution was unleashed in Persia. What should have unified the Christian faith instead created a deep, lasting rift. Yet, despite persecution, Christianity in the East didn't just survive, it thrived. While the Western Church got tangled in complex theological debates about Jesus' exact nature, disputes as much about politics as theology, the Church of the East embarked on one of history's most ambitious missionary programs. Without imperial backing, Christianity spread along trade routes with astonishing speed. By the mid-6th century, there were archbishoprics deep in Asia. Cities like Merv, Samarkand, and Kashgar on China's edge had archbishops long before Canterbury did. Thriving Christian communities existed across Central Asia 1,000 years before Christianity reached the Americas. In the Middle Ages, there were more Christians in Asia than in Europe. We've completely forgotten this. For huge chunks of its history, Christianity's center of gravity was in the East. Its success came partly from adaptability. Missionaries in China explained the Holy Spirit in Buddhist terms, suggesting Christianity was, broadly speaking, a form of Buddhism. This fusion made the religion feel familiar and accessible. But just as Christianity seemed poised for spiritual conquest of Asia, a new revelation emerged from the Arabian deserts, and it would change everything. The rise of Islam didn't happen in a vacuum. It occurred in a world exhausted by centuries of conflict between two superpowers, Rome and Persia. A devastating plague in the 6th century, likely the first appearance of bubonic plague, had swept along trade routes, ravaging cities from Egypt to China and causing severe economic depression. As Rome and Persia weakened, a trader from Mecca named Muhammad began receiving revelations from God. The message was powerful and simple. There's one God, and Muhammad is his messenger. It was a message of unity, preached in Arabic for Arab peoples. It drew on familiar traditions, venerating prophets like Abraham and Moses. It taught that believers who followed Jewish or Christian faiths, the people of the book, had nothing to fear. This message of conciliation was vital to Islam's early success. Muhammad and his followers worked hard to win support from Jewish and Christian communities. Many Jews in Palestine and Arabia welcomed Arabs as liberators from oppressive Roman rule. Some even speculated Muhammad was proclaiming the Messiah's advent. Similarly, nonconformist Christian groups who'd been persecuted by Orthodox Constantinople saw Muslims as allies. The new rulers often honored Christian priests in monasteries, even endowing them with gifts. This tolerance, combined with strategic genius and promises of both spiritual and material rewards, fueled explosive expansion. The system was brilliant. Booty seized from non-believers was shared among the faithful, with early converts receiving larger shares. It was a highly efficient engine for conquest. As Persia imploded from internal conflict and Rome was too weak to respond, Islamic armies swept out of Arabia. They didn't just conquer, they unified the economic heartlands of the ancient world. Egypt's and Mesopotamia's rich agricultural lands were now linked, forming a new political and economic behemoth stretching from the Himalayas to the Atlantic. The Islamic conquests created a new world order. The center of gravity, which had briefly shifted toward Constantinople, snapped back decisively to the east. A new capital was founded that would become the world's richest, most populous city for centuries, Baghdad. Baghdad perfectly symbolized Islamic affluence. It was the heart of royal power, patronage, and prestige. The wealth flowing into the city was staggering. Caliph Harun al-Rashid's treasury contained thousands of turbans, porcelain vessels, jewels, and vast quantities of gold and silver. This wealth fueled incredible prosperity and an intellectual revolution. Brilliant scholars, many non-Muslim, were drawn to Baghdad's court and other centers like Bukhara and Samarkand. A massive translation movement began, rendering Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit texts into Arabic. Works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Euclid were devoured and built upon. This was a golden age. While much of Christian Europe wallowed in poverty and disdained scientific inquiry, the Islamic world blazed with innovation. Scholars like al-Biruni established that the world revolves around the sun. Polymaths like Ibn Sina Avicenna in the West wrote groundbreaking works on medicine, philosophy, and mathematics. Algebra was developed here, driven partly by astronomers' practical need to determine Mecca's direction for prayers. Paper technology from China became widely available, fueling an explosion of literature, science, and philosophy. This flourishing civilization was a magnet, drawing people from all over, especially from underdeveloped northern fringes. And just as Rome's riches once created demand for exotic goods, Baghdad's wealth created demand for something the North had in abundance. From Scandinavia's dark forests and cold rivers, a new people emerged, drawn south by unimaginable wealth. We know them as Vikings. In the east, they were called the Rus. These weren't horned helmet barbarians of popular imagination. They were tough, savvy traders and ruthless warriors. And they didn't head west to England for fortune. They headed east and south, down Russia's great river systems toward the Caspian and Black Seas, toward the glittering markets of the Islamic world. They were creating a new Silk Road, the road of furs. Demand for animal pelts, sable, ermine, mink, fox, in the caliphate's wealthy cities was immense. Furs symbolized status and provided warmth. This trade was so lucrative it transformed northern Europe's economy. Astonishingly rich finds of Islamic silver coins, dirhams, have been discovered along Russia's rivers and across Scandinavia. We're not talking a few coins here and there. We're talking tens, maybe hundreds of millions of coins. In modern terms, a multi-billion-dollar industry. But the most important commodity they traded was far darker: human beings. The Rus were ruthless slavers, capturing local Slavic populations and transporting them south. So many were taken captive that their name, Slav, became the root of the word slave in English and many other languages. Beautiful women were especially prized. The trade was rampant across Europe. Prague became a major slave market. Even Venice, the Adriatic jewel, built early wealth on the brutal business of human trafficking. For centuries, Europe's economic engine was fueled by selling its own people to feed the richer, more sophisticated Islamic world's insatiable demand. The East's wealth was the magnet that pulled Europe out of the Dark Ages. This constant flow of trade and people created new power centers. The Khazars, a Turkic tribe controlling steppes north of the Black and Caspian Seas, became a major force, gatekeepers controlling the flow between north and south. So powerful they became that Constantinople's Byzantine emperor sought a marriage alliance, an almost unprecedented move. The Khazars grew rich from taxes and trade, and their capital Atil became a bustling cosmopolitan city with separate courts for Muslims, Christians, and pagans. In a move that baffled the world, the Khazar elite converted to Judaism in the 9th century, positioning themselves as neutral arbiters between Christian and Islamic worlds. But the Rus weren't content being mere traders. They began muscling in on Khazar territory, picking off tributary tribes one by one, redirecting tribute to themselves. Eventually, they attacked and destroyed Atil, effectively removing the Khazars from the equation. The Rus now mastered the western steppe. They'd founded a new state that would become Russia, built on trade profits with the East. But their focus was about to shift. Baghdad's caliphate was beginning to fracture. Internal divisions and economic pressures were taking their toll. As Muslim markets became less stable, the Rus turned their gaze toward another legendary city, known in their folklore as Miklagarthar, the Great City, Constantinople. This shift marked the beginning of a profound reorientation. Wealth and power concentrated in Baghdad for centuries were now diffusing. The Byzantine Empire was experiencing a golden age, its coffers filled by trade, its armies resurgent, and in the West, something was stirring. The Crusades. We usually think of the Crusades as purely religious war, a battle for the Holy Land. But that's only half the story. As Frankopan shows, it was also Europe's first major violent attempt to connect directly with Eastern wealth and power. By the late 11th century, Europe was changing. Population growing, economy developing, a new aggressive knightly class emerging. When Byzantine Emperor Alexios I appealed for help against Seljuk Turks threatening his eastern frontier, Pope Urban II saw an opportunity. He called for a great expedition to march east, not just to help Christian brethren, but to liberate Jerusalem. The response was overwhelming. Tens of thousands set off on a perilous journey that became a road to heaven itself. The Pope promised crusaders would receive absolution for their sins. Those who fell in battle would be martyrs. But alongside piety was greed. Crusade leaders, like the ambitious Norman Bohemond, quickly realized there were immense opportunities for wealth and power in the East. After capturing Antioch, Bohemond refused to hand it over to the Byzantine emperor as sworn. He carved out his own principality. He'd come to stay. The real winners of the First Crusade weren't the knights who settled in the Holy Land. They were Italian maritime city-states, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. They were quick to see commercial possibilities. The fledgling Crusader states, precariously placed and desperate for supplies and naval support, put the Italian fleets in a powerful negotiating position. In return for help, they were granted staggering concessions. In every captured city, they got a church, a market square, a third of all plunder, and complete immunity from taxes. These agreements became foundations for fortunes that transformed these cities from regional centers into international powers. An intense rivalry kicked off a great game for control of the eastern Mediterranean's lucrative trade routes. For 2 centuries, Europe poured enormous effort into holding these new colonies, but the Crusader states were islands in a hostile sea. In the late 12th century, a brilliant leader emerged to unite the Muslim world, Salah al-Din, or Saladin. In 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, he annihilated the Kingdom of Jerusalem's army. Soon after, the Holy City surrendered. Jerusalem's fall was humiliating for the Christian world, but it revealed a fundamental truth. For all the religious rhetoric, the real prize wasn't just Jerusalem, it was access to eastern trade routes. As Crusader presence in the Holy Land dwindled, Italian city-states simply adapted. They established new colonies on the Black Sea, which became a new gateway for goods from the east. Their true breakthrough, however, came from an unexpected quarter: the Mongols. The Mongol rise in the 13th century was one of history's most terrifying events. From Mongolia's steppes, a leader named Temujin, better known as Genghis Khan, united nomadic tribes and unleashed a wave of conquest, creating the largest land empire ever seen. The Mongol invasions were brutal. Cities that resisted were razed, populations massacred. Stories of their savagery spread terror across Asia and Europe. At Nishapur, every living being, men, women, children, even cats and dogs, was slaughtered, corpses piled into enormous pyramids as gruesome warnings. When Mongols swept into Russia, then Poland and Hungary, it seemed to Europe that the apocalypse had arrived. These weren't the mythical Christian king Prester John's men coming to save them. These were Tatars, from the abyss of Tartarus itself. But Mongols weren't just destroyers, they were connectors. Genghis Khan and his successors were masters of organization and administration. They established a vast, secure zone of trade and communication, stretching from the Pacific to the Black Sea. This was the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, and it made the Silk Road safer than ever. Ironically, Mongol conquests made it easier for Europeans to travel east. Missionaries and merchants, like the famous Marco Polo, could journey all the way to China and back with unprecedented security. They brought back tales of legendary wealth, palaces with golden roofs, spices, silks, precious stones. These stories fueled Europe's desire for Eastern goods and revealed a world far more sophisticated and advanced than Europe. The stability Mongols provided transformed European economies. Italian city-states, especially Venice and Genoa, grew fantastically wealthy plugging into this new Mongol-dominated global network. But this interconnectedness had a dark side. The Silk Roads didn't just carry silk and spices, they carried disease. In the mid-14th century, a mysterious illness bringing sudden death began sweeping through Mongol lands by the Black Sea: bubonic plague. When Mongols besieged the Genoese trading post of Kaffa, they began catapulting dead soldiers, corpses over city walls, one of history's first acts of biological warfare. Fleeing Genoese ships carried the disease back to Europe. The Black Death had arrived. It spread like wildfire along trade routes, killing at least a third, perhaps half, of Europe's population. It was a cataclysm, a horror on an unimaginable scale. To many, it seemed the world was ending. Yet paradoxically, the plague became the catalyst for Europe's transformation. Chronic depopulation led to massive labor shortages. Wages for peasants and workers shot up. Rents fell. Old feudal structures began crumbling. Wealth was more evenly distributed, creating surge in demand for consumer goods. It triggered what historians call an industrious revolution. People worked harder, productivity rose, new markets emerged, and this change was most rapid in northwestern Europe, England, and the Low Countries. These peripheral regions now began to boom. The social and economic transformations triggered by the Black Death laid foundations for the West's long-term rise. But Europe still had a problem. The old Silk Roads, traditional routes to Asia's riches, were controlled by powerful rivals: Venice and, more importantly, the rising Ottoman Empire, which captured Constantinople in 1453. To get spices and silks from the east, you had to go through them and pay their prices. For Atlantic seaboard kingdoms like Spain and Portugal, this was intolerable. They were at Europe's wrong end, far from the action. They began wondering, was there another way? Could they bypass the old routes altogether? This question would lead to two of history's most important voyages. In 1492, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, convinced he could reach the east by sailing west, set off across the Atlantic with 3 small ships. He was looking for China's Great Khan. He was looking for gold and spices to fund a new crusade to liberate Jerusalem. He found, of course, something else entirely. 5 years later, Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama successfully rounded Africa's southern tip and reached India. He'd found a direct sea route to eastern spices. These 2 voyages changed the world forever. Suddenly, Europe was no longer the Silk Road's terminus. It was at the center of a new global network. The Americas were connected to Europe and Africa for the first time. New sea lanes connected Europe directly to Asia. America's discovery unleashed a flood of treasure. Gold and silver from the Aztecs and Incas, civilizations ruthlessly conquered and destroyed by Spanish conquistadors, were shipped back to Europe in unimaginable quantities. The mine at Potosi in modern Bolivia was history's single largest silver strike, accounting for over half of global production for over a century. This torrent of wealth transformed Europe. It funded the Renaissance's cultural explosion, but it also funded centuries of near-incessant warfare. Competition between European states, always fierce, now intensified. This relentless conflict spurred incredible advances in military and naval technology. Europe's distinctive character, more aggressive, more violent, more competitive than other world regions, now paid off. This capacity for organized violence allowed a small continent on Eurasia's edge not just to explore the world but to dominate it. American silver didn't just stay in Europe. It became lubricant for new global trade. It flowed eastward to pay for silks, porcelain, and spices Europe still craved. Most ended up in one place: China. China's vast, sophisticated economy was the engine of global demand, with a particular thirst for silver. A silver road now wrapped around the world like a belt, linking Andean mines to Manila and Guangzhou markets. For a while, Spain and Portugal were dominant powers, but Europe's center of gravity was shifting north. England and the Netherlands, with more efficient financial systems, cultures of innovation, and above all superior shipbuilding technology, began challenging Iberian powers. The Dutch were particularly brilliant. In 1602, they created a single entity to conduct Asian trade, pooling resources and sharing risks. The Dutch East India Company (VOC) was a forerunner of modern multinational corporations, and it was ruthless. It didn't just want to trade, it wanted control. It used military force to drive Portuguese from the Spice Islands and establish monopoly. Amsterdam became the new center of global commerce, and the Netherlands experienced its golden age, producing breathtaking art by painters like Rembrandt and Vermeer. England followed suit, founding its own East India Company. It was a slow, frustrating process at first, but through naval power, commercial acumen, and ruthless opportunism, the British began carving out their own Asian empire. The pivotal moment came mid-18th century with Bengal's conquest, one of India's richest regions. Wealth flowing back to Britain was staggering. Men like Robert Clive became fabulously rich nabobs. The East India Company became a state within a state, an imperial power in all but name. But its rapacious greed led to disaster. A catastrophic famine in Bengal, caused by company's ruthless policies, killed millions. And the company itself, bloated with corruption, was pushed to bankruptcy's brink. To bail it out, the British government decided to raise taxes on North American colonies. The response was furious. In 1773, colonists dressed as Native Americans boarded ships in Boston Harbor and tipped tea chests into the water. The Boston Tea Party was protest against a bailout for a multinational corporation that had run amok on the world's other side. The American War of Independence was, strangely, a consequence of the struggle for Silk Road's control. Losing American colonies was humiliating for Britain, but it also sharpened focus on the real prize, India. And here Britain would face its greatest rival in a new great game for Asian control. That rival was Russia. Throughout the 19th century, Russia expanded relentlessly southward and eastward, absorbing Central Asia's ancient khanates and pushing frontiers ever closer to British India's borders. To the British, this was terrifying. The jewel in the crown of their empire seemed vulnerable. A century-long chess match began, a tournament of shadows played by spies, soldiers, and diplomats in Persia's and Afghanistan's mountains and deserts. This rivalry, this obsession with protecting routes to India, became British foreign policy's driving force, and this fear ultimately led Britain to form an unlikely alliance with old rival France, then even more astonishingly, with Russia itself. The Triple Entente of 1907 wasn't primarily about containing Germany. It was about Britain trying to manage imperial anxieties and protect its Asian position. But this alliance, designed to bring stability, did the opposite. It created a rigid bloc system that made Europe a tinderbox. Germany, feeling encircled by France and Russia, developed a siege mentality. An Austrian archduke's assassination in Sarajevo in 1914 was the spark that lit the flame. But fuel for the fire had been gathering for decades in Asia's heart. The First World War wasn't just European conflict. It was a war for the world, a war for empire, a war for Silk Road's control, and it was a war that would bring European dominance's age to a bloody, catastrophic end. As Europe's empires tore each other apart, a new resource was becoming critically important, one that would define the 20th century and beyond: oil. And the greatest deposits of this black gold lay in one place, the old Persian Empire's heart. Oil's discovery in Iran in 1908 by determined British adventurer William Knox D'Arcy was one of the modern era's most important moments. The British government, led by young, ambitious First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill, quickly realized oil was naval warfare's future. Control of Persian oil, he argued, meant sea mastery. In 1914, weeks before war began, the British government secretly bought a majority stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later becoming BP. The Allied cause, Churchill would later say, had, quote, floated to victory upon a wave of oil. After war, Britain and France carved up Ottoman Empire remnants, creating new countries like Iraq and drawing lines in sand that paid little attention to local history or culture, but very close attention to oilfield locations. This was the pipeline age, the modern Silk Road's new arteries. But this new empire age was built on shaky foundations. Across the region, nationalism was rising. People were no longer willing to see foreign powers exploit their resources. In Iran, charismatic politician Mohammad Mossadegh galvanized the country with a simple, powerful demand: nationalization of Iran's oil. To the British, this was disaster. It threatened to destroy the last vestiges of their empire and their solvency. When diplomacy failed, they turned to a new rising power for help. In 1953, the CIA, with British support, orchestrated a coup overthrowing democratically elected Mossadegh and reinstating the Shah. It was a pivotal moment. The United States had stepped into Britain's shoes. It was now the Middle East's dominant power, the new Silk Road's guardian. It was the beginning of the American Silk Road. The following decades were a new great game, a Cold War struggle for influence between the United States and Soviet Union. The battleground was the Northern Tier, the belt of countries along the USSR's southern flank: Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan. Washington propped up undemocratic regimes, turning a blind eye to corruption and brutality, as long as they were anti-communist. Iran's Shah, a vain man who believed his reign was miraculous, became one of America's staunchest allies, his regime kept in power by fearsome secret police, the Savak. This policy of supporting strongmen created festering resentment. Wealth from the 1970s oil boom flowed into a tiny elite's pockets, while the majority saw little benefit. In Iran, this discontent found voice in an exiled cleric, Ayatollah Khomeini. His message was simple. The West, and America particularly, was the great Satan, the source of all Iran's problems. In 1979, the dam broke. The Iranian Revolution swept away the Shah and brought Khomeini to power. The American embassy in Tehran was stormed, diplomats taken hostage. It was humiliating for the United States. Its key regional ally, its island of stability, was gone. The turmoil spread. The Soviet Union, seeing opportunity in chaos, invaded Afghanistan to prop up a floundering communist regime. Washington, spooked by Iran's fall and Soviet advance, began supporting Afghan resistance fighters, the Mujahideen. It was pragmatism, supporting anyone who'd fight Soviets. They funneled money and weapons, including advanced Stinger missiles, to a motley collection of religious fanatics, tribal leaders, and opportunists. Men like Jalaluddin Haqqani and a young, wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden became CIA assets. Simultaneously, the United States played a double game. The Iran-Iraq War, beginning in 1980, presented another opportunity. Washington supported Saddam Hussein's Iraq, seeing it as a bulwark against revolutionary Iran. It provided intelligence, credit, and dual-use technology, and turned a blind eye when Saddam used chemical weapons against Iranian troops and his own people. But behind the scenes, in a scandal becoming known as Iran-Contra, the Reagan administration was secretly selling arms to Iran, hoping to secure American hostage releases in Lebanon. When the Soviet Union finally withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, defeated and demoralized, it looked like a great American victory. When the Berlin Wall fell later that year, and the Soviet Union itself collapsed 2 years after, it seemed the West had won the Cold War. It was, some declared, the end of history. A new world order, led by the one preeminent power, the United States, was at hand. But seeds of future conflict had already been sown. Men who'd been armed and trained by the CIA in Afghanistan didn't simply lay down weapons. Anti-Western, anti-American sentiment, fueled by decades of intervention and double-dealing, hadn't disappeared. And the brutal Iraqi dictator, built up and supported by the West, wasn't a stable ally. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, he crossed a line. Access to Persian Gulf oil, President George H.W. Bush declared, was vital to U.S. national security. A massive coalition force was assembled, and Iraq's army was defeated in weeks. But Saddam was left in power. The following decade was one of simmering tension. Then, on a clear September morning in 2001, the world changed again. Attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon were orchestrated by Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. From their safe haven in Afghanistan, under Taliban protection, the response was swift. The United States invaded Afghanistan, toppled the Taliban, and began a manhunt for bin Laden. But the war on terror quickly expanded. Focus shifted to Iraq. Despite lack of evidence linking Saddam Hussein to 9/11 or proving weapons of mass destruction possession, the Bush administration was determined to remove him. Iraq's 2003 invasion was meant to be a short, sharp war bringing democracy to the Middle East and securing America's position in the world's heart. It became a catastrophic, decade-long insurgency that destabilized the entire region and cost trillions of dollars. The last few decades' story, as Frankopan sees it, is one of a doomed Western struggle to retain dominance over vital territories linking East and West. It's been a story of miscalculation, short-sightedness, and profound lack of understanding of deep historical forces at play. Because while the West has been fighting fires in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Silk Roads have been quietly re-emerging. A new network is being built, not of caravans and camels, but of pipelines, railways, and fiber-optic cables. Central Asian countries, once dismissed as backwater, are groaning with natural resources: oil, gas, gold, uranium, and rare earth minerals vital for our technology. Their cities are booming with gleaming new airports and luxury hotels. And a new superpower is rising to connect them all: China. President Xi Jinping has announced a vision for a new Silk Road economic belt, a colossal infrastructure project to link China to Europe through Central Asia. It's investing trillions in railways that will carry laptops and car parts from China to Germany in 16 days, in pipelines bringing gas from Turkmenistan to feed its growing economy, and in ports and highways across Asia and Africa. The world's center of gravity is shifting again, back to where it lay for millennia. We in the West have become accustomed to seeing our story as the story. But we're realizing we're just one part of a much larger, much older narrative. The Silk Roads are rising again. The birthing pains of this new world are all around us. In Ukraine's turmoil, Syria's tragedy, tensions with Iran. The world's future, Peter Frankopan tells us, will be decided along these ancient pathways. When you finish a book like The Silk Roads, the feeling is one of both humility and excitement. Humility because it forces you to recognize how narrow our typical view of history is. The story we've learned, the neat relay race from Greece to Rome to Europe to America, isn't the whole story. It's not even the main story. For most of human history, the action was somewhere else entirely. Peter Frankopan's great achievement is giving us a new map, not just geographical, but historical. He shows us the world has always been interconnected, and the engine of that connection has, for most of time, been the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures along Asia's great spine. Reading this book, you start seeing the world differently. You see the Crusades not just as holy war, but as economic war. You see America's discovery not as a beginning, but as a consequence. Europe's desperate attempt to break into a global system it didn't control. You see the two world wars not as purely European conflicts, but as death throes of European empires fighting over global resource control. And that brings us to this book's most powerful lesson, especially for someone stepping into a world changing faster than ever. History isn't just about the past, it's about the future. The Silk Road's reemergence isn't historical curiosity. It's the single most important geopolitical and economic story of the 21st century. Competition for Central Asian resources, China's rise, shifting Middle Eastern alliances. These aren't separate events. They're all part of the same grand narrative, the world's center of gravity returning to the East. So what can you do with this knowledge? First, change your perspective. When you look at a map, don't just see countries, see connections. See ancient routes, and new pipelines, and railways being built along them. When you read news about Ukrainian conflict, or a China-Iran trade deal, think about the deeper historical currents at play. You'll begin seeing patterns others miss. Second, be curious. The story Frankopan tells reminds us there are vast, fascinating worlds we in the West have ignored for too long. Learn about Persian history, Central Asian cultures, Eastern philosophies. In a world where these regions are becoming more powerful, understanding them isn't just academic, it's a vital skill. And finally, be humble. The West's rise was a relatively brief and often brutal chapter in a much longer story. As the world rebalances, we need to let go of the idea that our way is the only way. We need to be open to learning from others, just as the ancient Persians were. That was a summary of The Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan. We've covered a vast sweep of history today, but I'll be honest, a summary can only ever be a signpost. The real journey happens when you read the book yourself. It's in the details, the surprising connections, and the sheer intellectual thrill of seeing the world in new light. This podcast is a map, but the book is the territory. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity, I urge you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history, it's about understanding the world you're about to inherit. The link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It tells me these deep dives into great books are worth it, and ensures you won't miss our next exploration. Let's keep learning and growing together.